Mohammed El Naim, welcome to World Reframed. We're looking at pictures now of some protests that were happening in Madagascar recently. So the question I have for you is, what on earth has this got to do with colonialism?
Yeah, well, many of these countries which are rising up today were former colonies themselves. And when they were under colonial rule, they were ruled usually through elite intermediaries. And today, these are anti systemic revolts and anti elite revolts. And in many ways, then you could see these as a continuation of the struggle for decolonization.
Okay, let's get into that a little bit. In fact, a lot in a few minutes. I'm Duncan Hooper. This is World Reframed. I'm speaking to Mohammed El Naim from the Decolonial Centre. So, Mohammed, you gave us there a quick explanation of what's going on. Perhaps you can go a little bit into more depth. So, what we've been seeing situations in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Morocco, in Madagascar, where young people particularly have been coming out on the streets. Not only young people, but these are known as the kind of Gen Z protests because of the involvement of younger generations. And often they've been catalyzed by scandals around corruption, around a perceived failure of the authorities to bring about opportunity, I would say, for many in the population. So on the face of it, this is about government mismanagement, but you think it's something a bit deeper.
Absolutely. I mean, if you try to think about it, if you look at a country like Nepal, for instance, right? The amount of people who are young, and this is true in Morocco, this is true in many of these countries, and who see that their future is absent. They're aspiring, they might have many of them might even be well educated. But there isn't enough capacity, either economic or technical, in the country to be able to absorb them and their talents. They're looking at a life where, and this isn't very different than even people even here in England, where they'll never be able to buy a home. They will always live precarious lives. And it almost feels as if we're in Indonesia, when parliamentarians get a rise in their salaries, in addition to having all of their expenses covered, their travel, their food, etc. It's enough to live in an undignified way, for your day-to-day life like that. But then to see these kinds of elites who you see their children, a huge part of the protests in Nepal, for example, where, fascination with these Nepo babies on social media, were the children of elites, whether those elites were on the right-wing party, whether those elites were even under a communist party, lavishing in, Louis Vuitton clothes and sharing that in social media, and these cultures of nepotism, they feel that they have no opportunity, right? When you look at the people who stimulated the independence revolts in the colonies during the colonial era, they were similarly often people who were expected to uphold the colonial system, a small class of people who were expected to exactly be those kinds of intermediaries, but instead betrayed that calling because they also had these technical skills, but they saw all of their people living in misery and squalor, and they wanted to do something about that and spread dignity, and to build something for people, so that it's not just about extraction, it's not just about a small group of people making it big while the vast majority are either excluded or exploited. This is a similar generation, only they're looking not necessarily at a foreign colonizer, but they're looking at people who might look like them, but who have absolutely nothing to do with them, who are part of a transnational elite who put their money in the same tax havens and send their children to the same elite schools, Eton and whatever, and are completely disconnected from the vast majority. And so in many ways, I see that as the continuation of what really decolonization was all about, which is that everybody should be treated with dignity, not just a select few on behalf of um, a select few who are working on behalf of a global unequal system.
So your definition of colonializing here is really about elite groups taking advantage of other groups, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, like you said, foreigners or national powers. Is that right?
Yes, and it stems from the fact that basically the global south is a space for extraction, is a space for exploitation. That on a global level, there is a global inequality between countries, and that countries in the global north and former colonizing powers are the ones who benefit, and who benefited from a system that was built in that way. But the point is that they continue to benefit because of the fact that the elites in our country who were given a task during the era of decolonization, which is to kind of change the rules of the global economic order, to lift people up from out of poverty, and many countries have, right? And there's no denying that. But that itself has been lost, and that itself has, and there's almost a new bargain of our elite politicians with the old colonial order, which doesn't even necessarily require the formal colonial rule.
Right. Okay. So let's break this down to try and understand what colonialism looks like today, because obviously these empires of European powers were largely broken up in their, let's say, literal sense in the 1960s, 1970s, when many countries became independent. But your argument is that colonialism has survived that and simply changed its form. Can you describe maybe what that form is now, and maybe there's different ways that it manifests?
Sure. So if you look at, for example, the vast majority of countries which are high income countries, including countries which were formerly colonized, or at least countries which didn't benefit from the colonial order. So, for example, South Korea was formerly, used to be under the control and the domination of the Japanese. China was under the domination of various powers, mainly Western powers. Vietnam, and under the French, etc. Some of those countries were able to follow a path which was similar to what the richest countries in the world have followed, which is, for example, that they end up going through a phase of industrialization, and then eventually they emerge into a service economy, or a hybrid or combination of that. Um, but the reality is that for many other countries, they've been kind of locked into the same situation that they were supposed to be playing during the colonial era, which is that they offer certain kinds of primary commodities, crops. It creates kind of dependency. And the problem with that is that what that creates is incentives to become a rentier. So the difference between, let's say, for example, someone who's a productive, offering something to society, is that that productive entrepreneur, for example, is able to create lots of jobs. They're able to take their investments and reinvest. The theory is that grows the economy. But when you have situations where countries are locked into providing resources, commodity dependence, as the UN Trade and Development say, then you get these rentier elites who get their money not necessarily from profit and investments, but from their domination or their control over resources, their ability to outsource that control and resources from others and maybe get a tax on that, which is another form of rentier income. Um, and they have absolutely no incentive whatsoever to to respond to a tax-paying public. They make a lot of their money from selling these resources. And when you look at the elites of many of these countries, yes, they've had for a long time some kind of burgeoning middle class, but for the most part, they've been characterized by these rentier interests, which means that there's no real investment in the real economy. There's no opportunities for young people, and so when you're a young person, you in some of these countries, your job is either to hustle to get by, or to become a migrant worker in, for example, the Gulf countries. This was a serious issue, for example, in Nepal. And there almost feels like there's no social contract between the governed and the people who are governing. And so basically, because the continuation of those kinds of old, those kinds of relationships didn't come from nowhere. They came from the old colonial order. Um, but they haven't been resolved. And they haven't been resolved with the kind of international, but also within these countries, national impetus which is necessary for these issues to be resolved. What you end up having is a huge generation of young people who have no hope in the system, no hope in the political system, no hope that they'll have any economic opportunities, and who in many ways are not trying to raise revolt or disorder because they want to see instability, or it's because actually their day-to-day existence is unstable and their sense of a future lacks any kind of stability. There is no promise of stability for them. And I think that that characterizes a lot of the revolts we're seeing, and why they've been inflected with such anti-elite populism. Whether that's Indonesians extremely angry at the fact that their elites have had these increases in their thing, or whether it's Moroccans really angry about the amount of money that's being spent on the World Cup, or whether it's Madagascar, the people of Madagascar being angry because they have no access to electricity, or Nepal no access to social media, which is one of their few outlets for many people, for example, to work online, on Fiverr, on those kinds of things, but also to just express their frustration.
The situation you described, though, Mohammed, it's been the case for decades, for generations. I mean, you know, these people that we're talking about, you know, their parents experienced this, their parents' parents experienced it, their parents' parents experienced it. How do you change that? I mean, is there something that the world can do other than kind of watch on and say, "Oh yeah, this is bad"?
I mean, their parents or their grandparents. So I'll give you an example. My dad was born before Sudan was independent. My late father was born, and other people would have they would have been funneled into these national independence movements because that would have been the promise. Because because what would have been told by some of the same people who have unfortunately become these elites is that the reason why we're in this situation is because we don't have control over our own affairs. Today, when the world now is split up into multiple different independent states, um, you can't mobilize people along those lines anymore. Um, what I think what's necessary is that on an international level, there was an attempt, for example, in the 1970s, for there to be a push by some of the same global South elites today who hadn't become so wedded to the global order in this way, and kind of having their own mentality of it's just us, forget about everybody else, where there was an attempt to create a new international economic order, which required a lot of multilateral action. In fact, is almost the exact opposite of the kind of world that Trump is promising with his tariffs of like autarkic trading blocks, which are kind of separate. It was more of global integration of the global economy, but fair. The transfer of technology, the recognition that resource dependency has really bad outcomes. That that we should be trying to push for global development, world development. But then also internally within these countries, I think that unless we get rid of systems of power which allow for a small elite to be able to live very luxurious lives, and the vast majority to have no sense of future or hope. And in many ways, I see these revolts as kind of an emergency brake of trying to resolve that problem. And so it will require multilateral action, but it will also require really, really real democratization of these countries, which should not just be seen in terms of changing the political institutions, which I think is what's often on offer, but also changing the economic arrangements and the distribution of power and resources in those countries. And I think that's probably one of the really most important things. And I think it's also important to remember that there are countries who have escaped. For example, it's called the middle income trap. And what they've all had in common is that they've had a certain kind of role of an almost activist state, which is engaged in aggressive action against rentier interests that don't benefit the country, which creates uses a combination of carrot and stick. So these are strong states, but which also invest in industry and in the real economy. So there's lots of industrial, and I think a lot of the economic orthodoxy that's being offered by the multilateral institutions of the world is not fit for purpose in this kind of era. And so we have to support, I think, these struggles from below, but we also have to marry them, I think, with very real questions um, about the kind of real economic development which can prevent this cycle to stop and provide people with opportunities.
You've thrown up so many things there, Mohammed, which I'd love to come back on, and I certainly will. I mean, I think that the multilateral institutions is something we should definitely talk about. But before we do that, this prospect you've talked about of countries sort of radically changing their economic model, that's going to sound terrifying to a lot of people because that sounds like land reclamations, nationalizations, sort of a very chaotic, and one might say even lawless situation, as it would be perhaps seen by, let's say, investors, particularly people who stand to lose by this. Can you give an example of a country that you think would be an example of that having worked? And do you feel that, in a sense, that kind of, let's say, overthrow, and potentially a violent overthrow, because let's face it, there'll be a lot of resistance to that. I mean, I'm thinking, is Cuba your model for that after the revolution, or where do you see this having worked?
So, I mean, I think what I'm proposing is much more moderate than that. I mean, what I'm proposing is basically that if you look at, regardless of how many of these countries identify, whether they identified, for example, during the Cold War with the capitalist bloc, like South Korea, or whether they identified with the communist bloc, like China. What a lot of these, and we're looking at specifically, I'm taking East Asia because these are particularly the countries that have been able to escape.
Yeah,
If you
there's a
look
real
at,
mix,
for
isn't there,
example,
that's happened there. Yeah, and there has been some good success stories.
absolutely. Exactly. These are quite success stories because in the 50s, for example, the economic indicators of a country like China were actually very similar to Haiti. And now, China's lifted millions out of poverty, of course, with democratic deficit, and South Korea is a completely opposite case, right? But what they both had in common was that they had a, there's been different descriptions and explanations of this, right? Um, but they focus on industry, so industrial policy. There's lots of economists who have also been advancing this, but also a combination of a carrot and a stick. So in terms of the stick, and I'll give you just an example of something which doesn't require any kind of revolutionary upheaval. But if you look at some of in South Korea, some of like the big companies that exist in South Korea today, a lot of them came about because of a policy of the South Korean government, which said that it provided subsidies for certain kinds of investments in industries which were strategic and could employ lots of people and could raise the overall development of the country. But it allowed but if the performance metrics it required on these companies were not fulfilled by the companies who benefited from these subsidies, then they lost and they were allowed to fail. And through that, some of the other companies were allowed to succeed, right? And so in that kind of scenario, for example, what you have a very strong state, which, yes, it doesn't have a free for all environment for investors, because if you don't change it, but it has an attempt to change the base of the economic system, the economy, so that it's moving towards industry and not reliant on, for example, this rentier interest and this rentier release. um, you have a strong state, but it's not necessarily it intervenes in the economy when necessary. But you're right that it's not a free for all for investors to come in, because what you end up usually happening is that when these investors come in and they find that it's a better return on their profit to invest in something that might be of a rentier type rather than of the industry, for example, they'll do that, and that would keep that country bound in the economic arrangements that it's been in um, since colonialism. And I think, you know, again, you don't have to look to Cuba, or you can look at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and they have all sorts of resources about the real dangers of having a country stay in a situation of commodity dependence, because what ends up happening is, for example, not only does commodity dependence mean that there's not enough jobs to go around, And when there's not enough jobs to go around, there's revolutions that happen, which is an example of what we're just talking about right now. But there's also incentives to join a militia, or if you're in Haiti, incentives to join a gang. And the kind of second, third degree problems there is that it's an even worse environment for investment, for example, than it would be if there was a kind of state which is playing a role of I'm not talking about, commanding the entire economy, but playing a role of being strategic and being quite aggressive in and using its muscle to push for real economic development, even if that would make some sections of the elite and some sections, some business interests, uncomfortable.
Yeah, Mohammed, I want to just interrupt you there because we were talking last week, and this isn't planned at all, about the elections in Cameroon, and I actually brought up a little chart which I think I can show now as an illustration of what you're saying. So that is here we're looking at Cameroon's GDP per capita, right? And it looks quite impressive until you realise how long that scale is along the bottom. I mean, let me just take a look. That's 1960 across to 2020 there. So that's a really long spell. And if you then compare that with, you were talking about the countries in Asia, which is really interesting. And of course, the biggest example would be China. And if we then chart where China's GDP per capita, it starts from about the same place, right? And look how that has diverged. And I could pick other examples. Vietnam, you mentioned South Korea. They'd be slightly different. But here's two more African countries. That's Nigeria and Ghana on the bottom, and they're stuck on that trajectory. And I was talking to another a leader of the Congo, actually, the DRC, the deputy prime minister, who's just a fantastic economist. And he was outlining a lot of what you were saying, which is, we can't be commodity dependent. If you're stuck in this situation, people are joining rebel groups, we've got conflict. It's a vicious circle driving, pushing down on our economy. But the issue that they have is about funding it. And this goes back, I think, to what you were saying about the multilateral institutions, because it's very difficult for some of these countries to raise the money to do the things you're talking about, invest in the industry. Congo quite famously has tried to bring more development onshore by banning the export of cobalt, for instance, which it really sort of dominates the market. It's almost in a unique position in the world to be able to do that. But it's still not won that battle, despite this really drastic measure, because it basically finds itself up against such powerful forces in the rest of the world, big mining companies, traders, who all have a vested interest for the current system to carry on. And they're talking to the World Bank, and they were quite enthusiastic about the World Bank's help for them, but it's obviously not been enough for them to make this transformation. And so it feels a little bit like the system is locking this status quo in place. And I'm not optimistic about how we can break out of that. Are you?
I'm not optimistic, and I think one of the problems is that, again, it's always the second or the third degree consequences, right? I mean, if you look at the kinds of instability that we're seeing, I mean, obviously there've been other eras of instability, there's no doubt, but the amount of mass migration that's happening I'll give you an example. When I was involved in the pro-democracy protests in Sudan, I was in the military headquarters, in front of the military headquarters. We had a crew of friends who were there protesting together, spending time together, drinking coffee, and the people would sit down and they would talk about their dreams of what it would look like, what their country would look like if they got rid of these elites who seem to only have their own interests at heart, that they built institutions of governance, that they created opportunities, the kind of Sudan that they wanted to see. And I remember one of these guys, years later, obviously that descended into counter-revolution, which descended into war. Years later, some of the same guy who was most enthusiastic exponent of like the future Sudan, there was a slogan people would scream called Medania, which means civil democracy, and people would just scream it in the street. And it was just, it was an infectious kind of thing. People really believed that, political reform was actually like a stepping stone towards towards the kind of revolutionary change that they wanted to see for their country. This guy was now sending me text messages and asking me how he might be able to get to Europe, right? And I think that there's something in that one single story which I think encapsulates the story of millions of people who actually, a lot of people who are riding on the dinghies, a lot of the times, the way that migration is talked about here in Europe, oh, these are economic migrants, and then people will counter, no, they're fleeing persecution. But in many senses, yes, they are economic migrants, and they're economic migrants because of the fact that, and many of them are in other senses political exiles, who really, really, really tried to stay in their own country, who really would have been happy to be around the people that they love, to build a country which they wanted, and to be remunerated for it fairly. But they can't, because of the ways in which the system locks them in this situation, and because of the lack of climate action that compounds their problems, and because of the refusal to reconstruct the international economic order that creates the very basis for the kinds of mass migration waves which is leading to the rise of right-wing populism in Europe. But it, we live in a world that is averse to dealing with the root cause issues, and the root cause issues would require exactly that kind of international cooperation, collaboration. And instead, people are becoming more closed and allowing the problem to perceive, and trying to build fortresses in the small pockets and islands of stability that are left. And by any means necessary, even if dictatorship, even if the erosion of the democratic and civil liberties, they'd rather do that than address the root cause issues, which is, again, why I'm part of a group called the Decolonial Center, which is hugely and largely related to the fact that the global majority of this world are descendants of colonized peoples, and that colonial order is leading to the ruin of us all.
That's yeah, very strong. But I think if you look at the cases that you gave there, it's hard to argue against some of those points. Specifically, when we want to talk about how a failure to change. If we look at, for me, the example of the UN Security Council is just so brazen that everybody in the world pretty much agrees that we shouldn't have this system where some countries that won a war 80 years ago are making all the big decisions and have all the power at the United Nations, the most important multilateral institution. Everybody kind of agrees that isn't right, and yet there is almost no suggestion that that is going to change anytime soon. And I think that is one of the tragedies of our times. But I wanted to ask you, there is change happening because the world order is changing, and there is a new power that is on the verge of becoming the biggest economy in the world. It's starting to have a much, much greater influence in many of these countries where you're talking about in the global south. Do you see that as potentially being the catalyst to change? Because this is potentially the biggest change in global geopolitics since the world wars, which we call them, although not necessarily every country in the world involved, as we know, but certainly had a big impact on the world order. This is the biggest change. Do you see that as an opportunity, or do you see that as merely a prelude to a different type of, let's say, colonialism, to use that word, which is very broad?
I mean, and you could see, for example, the tensions that are already emerging with the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, and the accusations, for example, is way different. First of all, like the Chinese dealing with Africa, with, for example, the Americans, especially in terms of there's no debt trap diplomacy, or very little debt trap diplomacy, although there have been cases. There is, in some senses, a mutual benefit. But it's not the kind of silver bullet that I think multipolar enthusiasts believe it to be. Because, just to give you an example, in the commodity supercycle that happened as a consequence of China's rapid industrialization, a lot of countries actually went through a process of what economists are calling reprimarization, where they were actually on the path to actually kind of upgrading themselves on the value chain, and then went back because of the economic incentives of China's industrialization, and so at the end of the day, you know, some people, China used to be, this place poor, poor products or copy products, and now it's just an incredible superpower with, for example, their technology even competing the U.S. and causing the whole the
Sure.
U.S. and EU into kind of crisis of like identity. Who have been berating the world on the premise of free trade, only now to be champions of protectionism. Um, but that still doesn't change the fact that China's rise and then also the other industrializing countries' rise is still premised on the same system that led to the rise of the European countries in the first place. Somebody's got to do the work. Somebody's got to do the primary commodity work. Somebody's got to be locked in. And I think that those kinds of laws, economic laws, are still, if that's still the rules of the game, that's not necessarily the case. That the rise of global South, other global South powers, for example, will lead to a kind of trickle down effect. There still has to be something. There still has to be a really global conversation and global collaboration on figuring out how we can talk about global development and not just rely on hoping or just kind of having faith that the transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world will lead to good outcomes for us all.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. But before we finish, I want to just come back to one thing that you mentioned quite a lot earlier on, which was social media. So obviously we're talking to people on social media. Social media does give this platform to have this kind of discussion. It also gives people in other countries a platform on which they can organize, a platform on which they can challenge, a platform on which they can expose truths and stories and situations. And on the other hand, it gives a platform for fake news. It gives a platform for, let's say, brainwashing, if you like. It's used for censorship. It's used for propaganda. And the other thing about the technology and the social media, particularly, is if you look at it in terms of multipolarity, it's almost all American companies. There are some Chinese companies, and there are American companies, and they dominate this landscape. So, is technology bringing us into a new kind of colonialism where the views of one country are being, let's say, exported across the world, and people are being forced to look at things in the terms of that one country, which would be the US? Or do you think technology is potentially much more of a liberating factor, and that we should see it as something which is potentially a big part of the solution to those challenges which you've described earlier?
I mean, I think what you're saying is something I agree with, which is that technology is a medium. Like books before, like other kinds of things, you could have the medium itself is always going to be a space for contestation. You have your government censors who ban certain kinds of books, and now they build firewalls. Um, and then you have political actors who use them and distribute pamphlets and leaflets in clandestine ways. And I just think that that the incredible versatility of technology means that um, you know it can be manipulated, both by for and often, yes, like American companies, but also, for example, entrepreneurs who are kind of wedded to this anti-democratic project. The in Silicon Valley, the Dark Enlightenment, and tech, and trying to kind of usher in a neo-reactionary world order. But then you also have Discord channel in Nepal, which was being used. Of course, this is not an amazing example of democratic practice because it's only the people who are on the Discord who are able to use it, but at least symbolically able to bring to take a leaderless movement and provide some kind of political demand, which translated materially into kind of like like a transition to a new government, a new leader. Um, and so I guess this is the same way as I think about AI as well, is that I guess rather than thinking of the positives and negatives of technology, is that we have to understand that technology is just a fact, and there's no way around it. and that the old and part of the groups who are not able to keep up with the kinds of political developments that are happening in the world is because they're maybe wedded to older forms of media that are not up to the task of political activity in the 21st century.
Yeah, I have to say, for me, getting more people connected to the internet, and that's a particular problem in Africa. It's something we've been looking at Global South World, the high costs and just the challenges with bringing connectivity is going to be a positive. And I would like to end on a positive, Mohammed, because I think we have been quite negative. We've talked about a lot of the problems facing the world. But for you, over the next 10 years, what's a good outcome? What could you see changing in a positive way? And give us some reasons to be hopeful that some of the problems that we're seeing now might be at least alleviated.
I think that the 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 aversion that a lot of these movements, first of all, the fact that all of these protests are happening in the world for me is a huge positive, and and it shows the amount of energy and the amount of passion which millions of people around the world are declaring that they really want to see a different kind of world. I would be very hopeful if the kinds of I think that like the growth of these decentralized quote unquote leaderless movements is really important in rejecting the kinds of old forms of politics which were not fit for 21st century life. But I also think that if they started to coordinate with each other more, and if there was more discussions about the kind of positive world we want to see, I think that this could be the beginning of us really pulling the emergent. Like it's actually one of the few things that gives me hope, is the fact that we have all of these people rising up and saying that we want things to be different. That gives me hope that there will be enough political energy and mobilization for the kinds of radical transformation. And for me, this is a direct answer to the rise of far right populism all over the world. Is that there's groups all over the world who are saying, actually, we're not going to blame our neighbors, we're not going to blame migrants, we're not going to punch down against sexual minorities. We know that there's a small group of people who benefit from our suffering, and that they're organized globally. And maybe if we could organize globally, and this is me, my idealistic tone, maybe we can save the world. And I think for me, that's an incredibly hopeful thing.
So perhaps instead of having a G20 or a BRICS, which is very much led from the top down, you might be able to have a movement which was, let's say, more intrinsically democratic, perhaps, and that would be a counterpoint to the current system. That would be certainly a good and very interesting world to be part of, I think. Mohammed, it's been really good talking to you. Thank you for your time. Remind everybody that was Mohammed El Naim from the Decolonial Centre. This has been World Reframed. Please keep in touch with us on globalsouthworld.com.